Hello, Game Boys and Game Girls. I'm the Game Boy Guru, and welcome to episode 17 of...
Dramatic Readings!
Dramatic Readings is a series in which I, the Game Boy Guru, tell you about a game. But not just any game. A Game Boy game. But not just any Game Boy game. A Game Boy game that I have played, and reviewed, and written about. But you probably already knew that, didn't you? This time, we're looking at a game that I have held in high regard for many years, until somewhat recently. A game that I spent countless hours playing as a child. A game that I loved dearly for so long. But the question is, does it hold up? Is it still a good game, or was I crazy all that time? Have I been deluding myself? Am I just a gamer who loved the wrong game? Let's find out together, shall we? As we look at Castlevania, The Adventure. Nostalgia can be a very powerful force. It can make adults look back fondly on all sorts of things that, viewed objectively, probably aren't as great as we remember them. For a child of the 80s, that can be almost anything, from VCRs and teased hair to classic cartoons and our favorite movies and video games. There are times when it's hard to take a step back and look at those old favorites with a more critical eye. Sure, that one Poison album might be one of your favorites of all time, but musically, does it still hold up? What about your favorite childhood cartoon? Could you watch it today without cringing or thinking it's nothing but pure cheese? Now think about your favorite video games as a child. Sure, some of them probably stand the test of time, but for every Super Mario Bros. Or Contra, there's always a handful of games that we may still hold in high regard and still have much affection for. If we could set aside our own memories and youthful experiences, would we still hold those works in the same esteem? For me, one of those games is Konami's Castlevania The Adventure on the Game Boy. I mentioned this in my first article, but I'll recap for context. My parents wouldn't let me own a games console because they said, and rightly so, that I would monopolize the TV, as the family had just one. Thus, if I wanted to play something other than simple early PC games, I needed to save my money and buy a Game Boy. I dutifully saved my allowance, and upon my 13th birthday, my parents took the money I saved and bought me the Game Boy, and then bought Castlevania The Adventure as my birthday present that year. 1990 became a seminal year for me as a gamer, and cemented my love for the hobby as I poured all my free time into playing on that little gray brick. Much of that time was spent on Tetris, to be sure, but Castlevania The Adventure got a lot of play that first year, and for good reason. Having played a couple of the NES Castlevania games, it was a marvel to me that they could take that experience and downsize it for the Game Boy screen, albeit somewhat reduced in terms of game mechanics. Even so, it was a wondrous thing to 13-year-old me. Looking back at those times, I have fond memories of visiting my grandparents at their house, taking the Game Boy with me, and sitting between my grandfather's rocking chair and the bookcase against the wall, huddled in the corner underneath his reading lamp, playing Castlevania The Adventure while listening to my grandparents and my parents talk. I would occasionally steal away to the kitchen for a jelly bean, or gladly turn it off for a bowl of homemade ice cream, but I whiled away many a Friday evening in just that way. I remember the feeling of victory every time I would make it past stage 2, and the even greater sense of accomplishment when I had bested stage 3. I also fondly remember beating Dracula at my grandparents' house and gleefully showing my parents that I had finally beat the game after months of chipping away at it. Not that they cared, but as a young gamer, it was a triumphant moment. On the surface, the game looks excellent. The development team that handled this game certainly got a lot out of the Game Boy during its formative first few months, with good graphics that included nice layered backgrounds, a good use of the Game Boy's 4 tones of green in terms of shading, background elements, enemy and item recognition, and an overall atmospheric aesthetic that recalled earlier games in the series, but having its own unique flavor. The sprite for Simon Belmont's predecessor, Christopher Belmont, is recognizable in its basic form and animates well enough in similar fashion to the NES classics it's loosely based upon. The familiar candles flicker in a simple but effective 2-frame animation, and when you whip enemies, they die in a satisfying little burst of flame. The soundtrack is one of the highlights of the game. Hats off to composers Shigeru Fukutake, Norio Hanzawa, and Hidehiro Funauchi for their work on the game, because the music here, particularly that of the first 2 stages, is impeccable. The melodies are memorable and stay with you long after you power off your Game Boy. The sound effects are also well done, with a nice whip sound and a satisfying little crunch sound when you destroy a candle or vanquish a foe. The coin pickup and power-up sounds are all familiar and harken back to the halcyon days of 8-bits and game design teams using basic hardware to make excellent sound. This game is truly one of the highlights of early Game Boy titles when it comes to sound design. Gameplay is basic, with you controlling Christopher Belmont, running right to left, or sauntering, more on that later, or sometimes left to right, whipping floating candlesticks for power-ups and enemies in your path. Unlike the first NES Castlevania game, there's no sub-weapon here, so rather than hearts giving you ammo for a secondary attack method, they restore life, like you would normally see in other games. Coins are strictly for points, and littered around the game you'll stumble upon the occasional 1-up, as well as strategically placed whip upgrades in the form of a dark sphere. Your basic whip is a thin, stringy thing, and often takes 2 or more uses to kill anything. Upgrade once, and it's a thick, braided powerhouse with a ball at the end. Upgrade a second time, and your whip can suddenly throw fireballs. It's an interesting twist to the 2-upgrade system introduced in the first game, and it gives the player options in terms of eliminating obstacles, as well as reaching some candlesticks. Each time you get hit, you lose 1 level of whip upgrade, so 2 hits and you're back to the thin whip. Get hit enough to drain your life bar, and it's a trip to the woodshed for Mr. Belmont. Thankfully, you get 3 lives to start with, and you can earn an additional life at 10,000 points, and more after each successive 20,000 point total. You also get a small handful of continues in case you die. Let's face it, unless you're a Castlevania Wunderkind, you'll die. A lot. The chief complaint leveled against this game is its speed, or rather, the lack thereof. As I mentioned previously, Christopher Belmont saunters along at a snail's pace, and everything in the game seems to follow suit. Granted, for the game's difficulty, that helps a little, but it certainly counts as a negative. I don't happen to think it's quite as sluggish as some would say, but I will concede that it hampers the game somewhat. Secondly, the game's difficulty is quite high. This is offset somewhat by the fact that there are only 4 stages, but there are moments where you're almost guaranteed to get hit by an enemy projectile, like those wretched bouncing balls spit out by the Punaguchi. Some spots require near pixel-perfect jumps, and to expect that on the DMG's tiny, blur-prone screen is pretty harsh. It can be done, but it sours the experience. In addition, the aforementioned Punaguchis make things very difficult in stages 2 and 3, and if you don't have the timing down of when they spit out the large attack balls, or know where to stand so you can whip them, you'll almost certainly take at least 1, if not 2 hits, as there's no way to avoid taking damage otherwise. Worse yet, if you take a hit or two and are relegated back to the weakest whip, it takes 4 whips to kill them. These vile creatures rank up there with the bats in the original NES Ninja Gaiden as some of the most annoying, hard to avoid enemies out there. Playing this game again, I start to see my love and nostalgia for it slowly erode as I'm batted around by bouncing balls because the game has knockback like its predecessors, while expected to make pixel-perfect jumps and being in a constant state of frustration due to the game's less than stellar design. I still contend that it's not quite as horrible as some make it out to be, but I'm beginning to see that this adventure isn't quite the paragon of early Game Boy action platforming that I originally thought it was. Konami eclipsed this later with the sequel, as well as the Contra game Operation C and some other later Game Boy releases. The game becomes a blurry mess on the original Game Boy screen, and it makes me wonder how I ever endured playing it with all that blur. I tried to play it again on the DMG recently, and was shocked at just how blurry it actually was. Perhaps I've been spoiled with the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance all these years that I've owned them, but the system this game was designed for certainly shows its age when you play a game like this that requires a sharp eye and great timing and reflexes. It makes for a very difficult experience. Ideally, if one is to play this game today, it's via the Super Game Boy or Game Boy Player, or perhaps even on the 3DS via the Virtual Console. Not that I'm recommending that course of action. Sadly, I can only give this game a casual recommendation, despite how much I played and enjoyed it as a kid. It's fraught with too many design and execution flaws that the game's good graphics and excellent soundtrack can't rise above. Loose carts aren't expensive by any means, and you could pick this one up for under $10, but unless you're nostalgic for when games kicked your butt 10 ways from Sunday, or are a complete masochist looking for a short challenge, I might be inclined to skip this one. Definitely a try before you buy game in today's context. Sadly, I must own up to having seen this game through nostalgia goggles for the last couple decades, and admit that it's just not that good. Castlevania The Adventure, unfortunately, no longer lives up to my own hype. And that, my friends, is Castlevania The Adventure on the Game Boy. One of the earliest titles, and certainly one that set the standard for quite some time for graphics, sound design, and overall play mechanics on the Game Boy for quite some time. When I wrote this original review, I was fairly harsh on the game, and that comes through in the review. In the video, I softened the tone ever so slightly because, upon having further time to reflect, I still don't think the game is nearly as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. There are some people who rail on this game endlessly, but you have to remember the context of the time and think about just what the game accomplished on the hardware. The Game Boy was just not meant for high-action games, and while Castlevania The Adventure did have its problems, and certainly is not as fun or engaging as it could be if some of those issues were fixed, it's still quite the achievement for its time and for the hardware it came out on. So, while I still say that this is only something that I can casually recommend, I do think that everybody should at least check it out. Go watch another YouTube video with more gameplay footage, and get an idea for the game. Maybe see if a friend has it, or see if you can pick it up real cheap. As I said, it can be had for generally $10 or less, and there are a lot worse ways that you can spend $10 on a Game Boy game. I know I certainly have. I say that as a collector, but also as someone who just enjoys playing games in general. But what do you think? Did you play Castlevania the Adventure as a kid, or is this something you've more recently discovered? What about the sequel? How do you think it compares? Do you think the sequel blows this game out of the water, or do you think it's just a good natural evolution of what Konami started with Castlevania the Adventure on the Game Boy? Let's discuss in the comments section below and see if we can figure out a consensus among ourselves as to where this game really stands in terms of the history of not only the Castlevania series, but also of the Game Boy. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at GameBoyGuru. I will have a link in the description below to the original review this video is based upon, as well as a link to the main blog site where you can read all my Game Boy game reviews. That is GameBoyGuru.blogspot.com. Also, make sure you check out Nira and his channel. He provided the Super Mario Land overworld music that I use as the intro for all my videos, and he has a bunch of other great chiptune and game music covers on his channel as well, so make sure you go check those out. If you like this video, consider giving it a thumbs up to like the video for me, and also for subscribing to my channel, because that will show me that you like it and you want more content like this. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for playing, and game on!